O.G. Rose, and today we're going to be talking about the philosophical and dictatorial suffering servant, an essay on Hume to Hegel, considering the grave game theory dynamics of the state of now. This is an interlude in the absolute choice, and it should be noted that a reason Hume is so passionate about maintaining a dialectic between common life and philosophy, or the concrete and the abstract, so on and so forth, is that the issue is that when rationality becomes autonomous, when it doesn't have to reference anything outside of itself, then it also comes to feel in that very autonomousness that it should rule. Autonomous rationality tends to lead to a sense of autonomous rule or rulership. And if we must always be dialectical with common life, though, we can only ever be a steward, never a ruler who disconnects from our people without falling into false philosophy or bad philosophy, a force of destruction. So by common life, we should note, we're not just talking about returning to a farm or getting like a small house on the prairie or something like that, but common life being life that has a common reference point. There is something you reference regularly. You could also talk about committed life to something concrete. And common life is like, very often it's kind of tempting to have our life be not really common, nothing really regular, but to keep looking for a new experience, a new place to go, a new thing. So there's nothing common, nothing regular. Makes me think of Emerson in his essay on self-reliance, on the kind of fetish or temptation of always traveling, which, yeah, you travel a great distance, but you never gain depth. So that's what Hume's very concerned about. And if philosophy must always be in service of common life, then philosophy can't really be over life. It has to steward. It has to be more of a servant role. And that's what Mr. Hume wants. And then philosophy has to defend the common life. So you get philosophy as self-defense, which we talk about often. It's impossible not to naturally seek to be right. Like, if you think something, you naturally are going to think you're right about what you think, right? So thinking and philosophy are going to tend toward trying to be right. And that alone creates a danger, because if philosophy wants to be right and you feel like you're right, well, then you're going to feel like you should rule, that you should have control. And you see, if thought doesn't have to refer to anything outside of itself, then it can eventually reach an internal consistency of which legitimizes to itself its quote-unquote right to rule. And this is a problem. If thought has to steward or refer to something outside of itself, this can naturally bind its desire to seek to be right with humility. But if it doesn't have to do that, if autonomous rationality is indeed free to be autonomous rationality, it's going to lead to various forms of control or a sense of rulership, like you have a right to rule. Donald Livingston, the way he describes it, the great Hume scholar, he says, by the autonomy principle, this kind of a tendency of thought to try to be autonomous, the philosopher must consider his own system ultimately correct and to be entitled to rule over other systems. Failure to do so means that he is not taking his own philosophical thinking seriously and is doing violence to his integrity as a thinker. So if a philosopher creates a system, the philosopher must believe that system is right and try to defend it. And in so doing, if this system is right, there has to be right over other systems, and the philosopher has to defend it over those other systems, or kind of threat doing violence to his integrity as a thinker. So what we're getting at here is a problem with thought itself. The structure of thought itself to itself seeks internal consistency, seeks to be autonomous, seeks to avoid contradiction, and so doing naturally sets itself up to believe it has a right to control others. It has a right to rulership. And the philosopher, unless he's like not a true philosopher or is kind of risking integrity to his thinking, is naturally going to allow his or her thought to reach this state of being autonomous. And so here we see that philosophy and thought have a natural tendency in just seeking to be right, as they must, and indeed we need to seek rightness if we're going to correspond with reality. In thought being so naturally organized, it is also naturally organized to see itself or position itself rationally, quote unquote, as having a right to rule. Now, what this means is thinking naturally seeks power and totalitarianism for right reasons. unless it is made dialectical by choice and forced into primordial participation in custom, to allude, as Livingston put it. Otherwise, thinking and rationality will almost innocently stumble into purging itself of the authority of custom, the authority of things outside itself, at which point it will be unbound, and at the same time see itself as rightly justified and even obligated to rule over other systems. Otherwise, the rationality couldn't really take itself to be right, could it? And isn't it immoral to not want others to be right like us, and to not help them be right as such? In this way, autonomous rationality, which is AA thinking, must naturally seek making itself totally right, at which point it will be epistemically immoral for the rationality not to impose itself on others. And so a lack of dialectics and AB thinking leads to a world of competing totalitarian possibilities and forces. So what this means is that, referencing Mr. Clifford on the idea of epistemic responsibility, where if you believe something is true, then it's kind of intellectually immoral for you not to share that truth with other people. So likewise, as a philosopher's system gains epistemic coherence, it becomes increasingly more a matter of epistemic responsibility for that philosopher to become a king who shares it with other people. And of course, those other people with their own philosophies will do the same. And so gradually and slowly, autonomous rationality leads to a world of competing factions, of competing wars between internally consistent systems that are compelled by an epistemic morality to enter war as such. And so we start to see why philosophical consciousness, unleashed philosophical consciousness, all seeking internal consistency, tends to lead to totalitarianism and conflict. Dr. Livingston continues, the sense of fitness to rule internal to the philosophical intellect is transformed into a passion by an original propensity of the mind, which Hume thinks is triggered whenever men reach the level of philosophical reflection. So what Hume is aware of is that once the man begins philosophizing, then the very act of philosophy leads toward a sense of a fitness to rule, because you know the truth, and if you know the truth, well, you have a right to rule, right? So there's something about power and philosophy that are inherently bound together. And it's kind of like, how does autonomous rationality not end up here? It seems like it must. And so this is why Hume is so obsessed and concerned about philosophy returning to common life, because otherwise the world has to end up into a bunch of competing conflicts. I think things like neo-pragmatism, science, all of these, empiricism, all of these things tried to do something very similar to Mr. Hume in creating a reference outside of thought that could bind power, right? Because everyone has to turn to the science. And I think that's all well and good. Unfortunately, power, the state, they tend to take control of science, right? Or pragmatism or empiricism. Who decides, who controls the studies, who's funding them? There's a lot of problems there. And also, pragmatism leads to reductionism, or can lead to reductionism, and kicks out metaphysics, which again, as we were talking about over at Voicecraft on the conflict of mind about Mr. Aubrey, is that without metaphysics, once you get rid of metaphysics, you don't have to worry about these same problems that Hume is describing, but then you run in, you're in trouble of the meaning crisis that everyone is, Vervaeke, etc., are concerned about. But that means we have to go back into this very risky realm of philosophy, and if we're going to go back into this risky realm, we're at risk of all these problems that Mr. Hume is outlining. Are we ready for that? This is not easy. This is not easy at all. So we need this common life because we need a commitment. Thought has to commit itself humbly to something outside of itself and serve it. And, this is very important. Like, you could say what Hume really, really wants is for philosophy not to be a king, but the philosophical servant, we could say, versus the philosophical king. But philosophy will not naturally realize that on its own. It will naturally experience itself as having a right to be a king, so it just has to know better. And that's what Hume wants to really, really get across. And I would say basically all the modern counter-Enlightenment thinkers do, and counter-Enlightenments in general. To help elaborate the case further, there's generally really only three possible ways for rationality to avoid naturally seeking complete rightness and thus compelling itself into totalitarianism according to epistemic responsibility. It could intentionally be wrong, could never be totally right, or it could be dialectical. The first seems basically impossible, unless you're going to be insane or intentionally stupid, but how do you do that? And how do you run a society? Madness could do it, but then the social bonds could collapse. you could never be totally right. But then if thought intentionally never tries to be totally right, it kind of negates itself and effaces itself. And how do you even do that? Like, the only option seems to be dialectical, to have thought have a dialectical movement. And obviously we're aligning Hume with Hegel here, because Hegel gets accused of contributing to totalitarianism, and sure, he can be interpreted in light of that project, as can Plato if you wanted. But the nature of the dialectical thought means that thought has to operate with history, you could say. Like, if we talk about history, philosophy must use the material of history. It must refer to something outside of itself. And there's arguments to be had. It would seem to me that in the way that Hume talks about common life, Hegel seems to position history. And history is the binding principle of rationality. If you do not have tradition, and that's very counter-enlightenment. Hegel here is very counter-enlightenment. If you don't have history, or even just the act of turning to a Bible, like the Bible, yeah, you can interpret the Bible, but the act of a common reference point for interpretation, that right there is a big deal, because it binds interpretation. You can't avoid interpretation. If you deny interpretation, you're in the realm of totalitarianism. But if you become if you lose heart and say it's all relative, then you're in nihilism. So we have to learn an art of interpretation. And that seems to be very much the art of dialectics. And the Bible is outside of yourself. History is outside of rationality. Common life is. And all of these things can be things which thought can commit to and then bind itself without trying to avoid being totally right or intentionally being wrong. Neither of those seems to be very useful. And I would say a lot of the great philosophers are trying to deal with this problem of totalitarianism. Like, if we look at Deleuze on the notion of trying to deconstruct epistemologies of representation, the kind of ideas, if you can represent, you can capture, and if you can capture, thought can have power over. So how do we break that up? And we have ideas that I'll talk about: essential difference. Difference is ontological. You don't have as much relation. Relations are dangerous, because if you can relate, you can make intelligible, and then you can control. So you see in Hume a strategy by which to bind philosophy, but there are then just the questions of, does it work? Does it not? Dugin has different strategies, and that's why we are talking about in Belonging again the need for a new address. But anyway, the point is that thought naturally operates in a manner to become empowering. And I should also note that Mr. Barnes, in his work, The Iconoclast, does excellent work. Excellent work on this problem. And again, Dr. Livingston notes how thinking, rationality, and ultimately philosophical reflection experiences itself as emancipated from the prejudices of common life, and indeed philosophy will find common life lacking any ultimate justification, for such is impossible. So here's the other issue. Like, philosophy, if it's not committed to common life, will always find problems with common life. It will always find a lack of axiomatic justification, because such is not possible. You can't have a transcendental grounding. It will always see inadequacy in common life, and then it will see itself as internally complete. And so right there, like, if it's looking for ultimate philosophical justification for common life or anything, or history or whatever, it won't find it. And then that will be evidence to it that it has a right to rule, and then it will become totalitarian, or it will become melancholic and hopeless. Either way is not adequate. Either way is not going to work. And so the other thing, like we talk about in Belonging again, common life is indeed risky if you don't return to common life, because it can lead to givenness, like experiencing things as given, which leads to a thoughtlessness, which leads to the Hannah Arendt banality of evil. And so philosophy is going to probably see a lot of bigotry, xenophobia, immorality, evil even in common life. And that will further give philosophy reason to see itself as fit to rule, because look at these backwards thinking people. Well, then philosophy becomes a tyrant. And the other key point is that the philosopher king almost always must become a philosophy dictator. Because a king would live with the people. A good king is a steward. And it's possible, of course, it's possible to have a good king, but a philosophical king is probably going to rise, especially in the modern world, precisely because it sees the inadequacy of common life, and it has visions and plans top down on how to make the world a better place. And that, of course, that leads to great violence, because you tend to punish those of whom do not align with you. And, the other issue for the philosopher, and this is very important, Dr. Livingston with Hume will talk about the philosophical ascent, which is once you see the groundlessness of the world, you almost you can't unsee it. It's like that wonderful part at the end of Nabokov that I always talk about, Speak Commemorated. As Nabokov writes, it was most satisfying to make out among the jumbled angles of roofs and walls a splendid ship's funnel showing from behind the clothesline as something in a scrambled picture, find what the sailor has hidden, that the finder cannot unsee once it has been seen. So it's one of those kind of pictures that once you see, you can't unsee it. Well, so it goes with the groundlessness of reality. Makes me think of They Live, as Zizek talks about by John Carpenter. Once you put the sunglasses on and see that you're surrounded by aliens, you can't unsee it. So the issue is that once you get philosophy and you see the groundlessness of being, you can't unsee it. And so that right there, you begin the philosophical ascent of, being like, wow, I'm going to find the ultimate principle, the ultimate state, the ultimate government, and give reality a grounding, or give people what they don't have, or you enter the philosophical melancholia. And these things go together. As you lose the ability to embed back in common life, you can never go home again in the same way you can never return to childhood, Eden, however you want to put it. There's a certain melancholia that comes with this, because you feel sad. And in response to that melancholia, which is only worsened by the grand technology, Paul Virilio, this is talked about in Second Thoughts, as he thinks, and also Thomas Pynchon is quite good at this as well, with the Odifia Mass in The Crying of Lot 49. Anyway, as you ascend and you can't re-embed in common life, you get a melancholia, a certain sadness, so there's a kind of nihilism. What Hume means, what is meant by philosophical melancholia, I think, is basically the meaning crisis. They're very, very similar. In response to that, you can have a hopelessness or a kind of bitterness or a kind of resentment to your inability to connect with people like you once did. And that can lead to a philosophical tyrant or seeking power to get back. You can have a revenge, or you can have a certain sort of looking down at people for being so naive. So all of this is suggesting that philosophy without a dialectic outside of itself is very likely to turn into to something very totalitarian. And the other thing that Livingston points out is that as you learn the truth, quote unquote, with philosophy, there's a certain heroicism. You feel like the heroic ascent. You feel like you're coming out of the cave. You're growing and you're getting smarter. And that right there, because there's a kind of heroic act to the philosophical ascent, further contributes to a feeling that you have a right to rule. And this is a problem. And as you kind of rise, this is where a pride can set in, this philosophical pride of being a hero, being better than other people by going through philosophy. And this is, as Dr. Livingston writes, the sublime philosopher, who has seen the sublimity of philosophy, cannot entirely forget his former self, and now, in having consciousness raised, feels resentment toward the unreflective world of custom, which has so long held him under its dominion. Philosophical contempt and resentment are not directed at anything in particular, but to custom in general. So this is the other problem, is philosophy's target, if it becomes resentful, is not like a particular community. It becomes like everything. That's why it's totalizing. Like the world, everything has to be burned down. Everything has to be changed. The zeitgeist becomes the enemy. And if you, as Hegel, do not have this honoring or understanding that thought cannot think ahead of itself, as he famously puts at the beginning of the philosophy of right, which is a binding principle, mind you, then you're going to have visions of how the future should be, and you're likely going to see inadequacy on how the future is. And so you're not going to be targeting a particular thing. You're going to be targeting everything. And so this is why you're a totalizing tyrant. You're after the entire world. And this is where what the common life is in Hume as a binding principle of rationality, so we can see the now, the movement of the now in Hegel's philosophy of right as the binding principle. We have to think the now, tarry with the negative, as Zizek and others have put it. And the negative is the now, the real. The real is a binding principle from Lacan. The now is a binding principle of Hegel. Common life is a binding principle. If there is no binding principle, thought tends to avoid the real and thus become pathological, melancholic, or pathological like the tyrant. The tyrant is pathological. You see, all of these things are speaking in similar things. As Lacan warns, if we avoid the real, we become pathological. As if we don't tarry with the negative, we tend to seek a completeness that leads to pathology and self-effacement. If we do not reference the now of history, the movement of the present moment, we tend to have ideas of the future that leads to pathology. And likewise in Hume, if we do not honor common life, we tend to enter into a philosophical pride that becomes extremely destructive. And this is where philosophy needs to work on questions of like how to be children in Zarathustra, how to be our own self-turning will, motivation, libido, not designing the world, but living with the now in a manner that we use philosophy to preserve and honor the now, to seek, say, beauty, philosophy of glimpses, phenomenology of glimpses, as opposed to notions of how to purge the world of some sort of zeitgeist or custom or way of thinking that we will naturally, in the philosophical sense, see inadequate, certainly because it lacks grounding, and also because we could feel resentful toward it in having kept us from seeing the quote-unquote truth in the past. These are dangerous mixtures, which is why philosophy is very dangerous. It's like fire. You need to put fire in a fireplace. If not, it will burn the whole house down. And yet, without fire, you can't cook food and you can't stay warm. This is philosophy. Philosophy is a dangerous necessity. It keeps us safe. If we don't have it, we're going to be taken advantage of, as Hume warned about, by some king coming in and telling us how we should live our life. We need philosophy. You need good philosophy to defend yourself against bad philosophy, like the philosophical tyrant who becomes this suffering and serving. This is the other thing. The king, the philosophy king as dictator, is suffering in their inability to connect with common life, so they have a certain pity for self. And this is where they become truly destructive, because there's a certain, if they're not prideful, so what Hume has described, there's a certain pride that can come, but then you also have a form of the philosopher that in their disconnection, I think this is actually more of what describes the tyrant today. They become this kind of suffering and serving tyrant. Like the philosopher king, who's a philosophy dictator, then becomes incredibly difficult to overthrow because they become a suffering and serving tyrant. And please note, to finish the point I was just making, you need philosophy because in a world where philosophy has been unleashed, which, following of Peter Berger, is the very character of globalization and pluralism and diversity, because the encounter of the other, you could even think like a Levinas, inherently brings with it questioning of the self. So as the world is globalized and pluralized, everyone is a philosopher now, as Berger puts it. Everyone is an existentialist now. And where everyone is an existentialist, that means philosophy is unleashed, like Pandora's box, upon the world. And so basically there's no option to not do philosophy unless you're going to be a fundamentalist who's an isolationist. And yeah, you can do that strategy, and some people are doing that. And various exodologies or isolationists are basically that, but I'm not sure, that's not the sociological address that I'm interested in, because I think that's already been done, and I think that leads to various pathologies. And I'm not, by me saying I'm not interested in it doesn't mean there's no value to it. It means I'm personally curious and belonging again about the possibility of a quote-unquote new address. Anyway, given the unleashing of philosophical consciousness, it's you require good philosophy to defend yourself from it. Well, likewise, you need it to defend yourself from the suffering and serving tyrant and to not become one yourself. And what this means is like, the more and more, with philosophy comes this feeling of rationality almost being like a mental illness, as Matthew Stanley put it. You feel you just can't connect. You can't connect with common life. Nothing can be simple anymore. You feel mentally overwhelmed. And you're also then in a position of where you feel like, yeah, and everyone out there, they don't know the truth. They don't need these things. So you're suffering, and then you're trying to help others see the truth, and then to bring them to your notion of the truth. And if people tell you you're a tyrant, you're like, well, that can't be the case because I'm suffering. So suffering becomes the philosopher's suffering in their detachment from embeddedness, then leads to a function of self-deception from their actions as being totalitarian, and so they become incredibly difficult to stop. They become a kind of suffering servant, like a suffering tyrant. And when everyone today is suffering, and everyone, there's this kind of idea that you don't know how hard it is to be a philosopher or to think in these terms. Well, then there's a certain pity that comes on, and it's very difficult. When a tyrant is suffering in their own minds, it is more difficult for them to see how they are tyrannical. And this greatly enhances the difficulty of our problem. The good and the true must first be real for both Hume and Hegel, and rationality will naturally move away from the real in favor of its own internal consistency. And this is very, very dangerous. And what has to happen too is, as philosophy, Livingston will talk about the King Midas and the King Midas touch. Philosophy allows you to see everything as the subject of philosophy, because philosophy can be about anything, so you can't stop the spread of it. And once the spread occurs, the probability of philosophical tyranny of some manifestation is incredibly high. So we have to bind it. We have to look for binding principles. And I think basically this unleashing of philosophical consciousness, again, is the meaning crisis. And both Hume and Hegel give us tools to deal with it. And the meaning crisis is also the conditions by which philosophical tyranny spreads. And so how do we avoid that? How do we work against that? Well, I think we can look toward the modern counter-enlightenment. I think we need to look at the thought of, the way Livingston has this great part where he says philosophical reflection has a role in criticizing civilization. So stopping the tyrant, you need to question, you get educated. I mean, education is ultimately a kind of philosophical act, and you need education to stop the tyrant. But then there's the philosophical tyrant. Just because you have philosophy and question and criticism does not mean you're immune from being a tyrant. There's just another kind of tyranny that can emerge. So philosophical reflection has a role in criticizing civilization, but unless it is to degenerate into false philosophy, it can criticize only what it is a mode of its own participation. Philosophy must bind itself to criticizing and refining only that which it participates in. And so that right there tends to help it from being overly deconstructive. Deconstruction then, as Derrida intended and hoped for deconstruction will then be in service of reconstruction. We are only tearing down to create a clearing where being can come forth at a new quality in a Heideggerian sense. And when philosophy must participate in that which it criticizes or philosophy about, then it has skin in the game, to reference Mr. Taleb, and therefore it is not going to be as likely to fall into the pathologies that have been described. And I think both Hume and Hegel can help us with that. But more on that has to be said on the case, because ultimately common life requires an absolute choice, an absolute commitment, a choice where we commit to something in a very absolute sense. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Anchor, Instagram, so on and so forth. Please check out Amazon, where you can find the books. All purchases and reviews are deeply appreciated. And thank you so much for your time.